Alrighty, so hello everyone, and so you may notice that we did skip over last week, and that is because I was not here. But we will continue on with our coding back course, and in this coding back course, um, we over last week we went over the warm-ups, which was the very first part. And if we go over here and we go to codingbat.com and we go to the Python section, we can see that we went over this little section over here and we taught 3 of these questions, and you guys should have just tried to gone ahead and practice these yourselves. And hopefully you guys probably understood most of these problems, as these problems are fairly simple, as these are just like simple warm-up problems, and there's no loops, there's no complicated data structures, and if you ever got stuck, then say you go to this problem and you didn't know how to solve it, you could just press show solution, and you would just see the solution, and you could kind of match it up to what your code is and either see what you did wrong or you can see what you did better. Obviously, both of these over here work, and if I were to copy this over to here, it would also work. And as we move on through this course, we're going to be going to warm-up 2. Now, we're not going to be staying long on warm-up 1 because this is a little simpler, but this kind of moves on to the medium problems. And in the medium problems, everything is going to be slightly more complicated, so obviously slightly longer solutions. But we're also going to start implementing things like list problems and implementing loops and even slightly more hard logic kind of puzzles that we have to solve ourselves. So this class, we're going to be going over these three questions: string times, front times, and string bits. And so for these three questions, um, you guys can go ahead and do it yourselves and try and follow along. So that can be helpful in making sure that your kind of logic pattern is correct. And even just if you've already done these problems, then you can just kind of check over, did I write this program correctly or not? So I'll give you guys a second to kind of open up these problems yourselves. Alright, so hopefully you guys have opened up the problem for yourself. So the first problem that we're going to go into is string bits. So, alright, so the string bits problem, so what is going to be happening is you guys should probably try and look over the instructions over here, see these test cases that they gave you. I'll give you guys a second to do that. Hopefully you guys have had a little time to read this. So these are some fairly simple instructions, nothing too complicated. So it says, given a string, return a new string made of every other character starting with the first. So hello yields HLO. So as we can see, we have a couple important parts to this. So we know, first off, that our input or our parameter is going to be a string, as it says over here. And not only do we know that it is a string, but we also know that it also has to return another string. And so this new string has to be made up of every other character starting with the first. So that is going to be the contents of the string. So hello would yield HLO, as in this H over here, skipping over the E, going to this L over here, skipping over this L, and then finally to this O. So that is how this three character string is composed of. And we can see that this can happen in every single one of these cases over here. And obviously when we test it, there's going to be a lot more cases. So the first thing that we need to do when we write a CodingBet program is we need to make sure that we go ahead and we define our function. So we use the signature define, and we use the function name, which is given to us as string bits, right? And since we know that it is a string, in fact, we can enter in any sort of name that we want for it. In my case, I use string. I think that's also what the website will give you, but it really does not matter what you name it, as it is only for your own purposes, and no matter what you name it, the program will still be able to give that value to this function, right? So we can remember that this is exactly how we define a function, and in this function we need to make sure that we remember that we are trying to return a string. So there's two ways that we can kind of go about this. So we know that we have to go throughout this entire string. Now, in order for us to go through this entire string, there's two different ways to do this. And these two different ways are the two different types of loops. Now, we have the while loop and we have the for loop. And in order for us to determine which one is more effective, we'll just go over both of them, right? So, for the while loop, we can remember that all we need in order to define it is kind of that condition. And we can kind of decide what that condition is later on, but for now, we can just write while, and I suppose we can just do some underscores for now. And so this is kind of the basis of what the while loop would look like. Now we need to make sure that we indent this properly because indentation is very important. Now, in order for us to properly be able to iterate through something using a while loop, that condition needs to be almost controlled. And what I mean by controlled, I mean like there's kind of a cap, and on top of the cap there's also an iterating variable, and iterating essentially just means going up or going down, just kind of incrementing that number by a certain margin every single time, right? And when we iterate through this while loop, we need to make sure that we don't iterate past, say, the end of the string. So if there's just two characters like H and I in here, we don't want to go and look for the seventh character because, well, the seventh character simply doesn't exist, right? So in order for us to kind of define this iteration, we're going to need a variable. So this variable will start at an index. Which index? Well, the first index of the string. And we got to be clear that the first index of a string is in fact 0 and not 1. So we have x is equal to 0, right? So this x throughout this entire while loop, throughout this while loop will slowly be going up. So we know that there has to be an x over here. And now that we know that there has an x, so what's so special about this x? Well, this x indicates the index within this string. And what index can it not go past? Well, it cannot go past the length of the string, right? So essentially what's going to be happening is we're going to be doing x is less than len string. Now let's go over what we have over here, right? So we have x is equal to 0, and so this x is going to be the index. Now if we want to be more clear, we can just label it as index, right? So while index is less than the length of the string, blah blah blah. Now why do we use a less and say not less than or equal to? Well, we have to remember, since this is length of string, it will return, say for high, 2, right? But the highest index in high is only going to be 1, because the index starts at 0 and not at 1. And so if we were to count the number of letters in here, we'd go H is the first letter, I is the second letter. However, when we're talking in, I guess, programming terms, H is going to be the 0th letter, and I is going to be the first letter, right? It can be a little confusing, like English-wise, I guess, but that is kind of how programming works. So I'll let you guys look over this for a second. So now that we know, okay, well, we're going to be iterating through this loop. Well, what's so special about this iteration? And what do we want to do within this iteration? Well, within these iterations, what we are going to want to do is we're going to go through this string. And ultimately, we are trying to return a string. And so in order for us to return a string, well, the string has to exist. So we can kind of name this string whatever we want. I like to just name it string1. Obviously this can get a little confusing when you have, say, more variables or stuff, but this is a fairly simple program, so for now this will be alright. So we have string1. So now what does string1 equal to? Well, string1 doesn't equal to anything yet because we want it to be a blank string. Now how do we label a blank string? Well, all we need to do is just put 2 double quotation marks. So what this does is it tells the program, okay, string1 is equal to, so we see these double quotation marks here, so that means that this must be a string, and there's something in between here, right? Well, after this, there seems to be the second double quotation mark, so that means it ends the string. So what string1 equals to is a blank string. So that's kind of how you define a blank string. Now that we know, okay, we have our string that we want to return, we have the index inside the string that we are reading from, and we have this while loop. How do we program this? So first off, we know, okay, for every single one of these, they all contain this first letter. So what are we going to do? We're going to do string1 is plus or equal to, or we can just go ahead and we can do string1 is equal to string1 plus, but either one will work, right? So string1 is equal to string1 plus. Well, what do we add to it? Well, since this is Python, what we can do is we can just do this, and we can return string1 plus string at index x. So that means that at the index x, at this index of x, at the index of index, sorry, it will find whatever character is there, and if we're going to go by hello, we can see that the letter H is at the index of 0, right? So that means that essentially what this is it is just a 0, or an H, sorry. And so this H is going to be added to string 1. So what string 1 is equal to now is string 1 is equal to H. So now that we know, okay, well, we can just add every character now. But if this were to continue, then the string 1 would just equal to H, 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 right? And that's not what we want. We want it to be every other character. Well, how do we make it every other character? Well, if we were to increment x up by 1, say by doing that, then what would happen is the next one in hello would be an E. However, we want to skip one. So how will we do this? Instead of incrementing by 1, we increment by 2. And what this does is essentially the index will go from 0 to 2. And this allows us to skip every other character. So that, in the end, is our ultimate goal. And since we have this, all we need to do is just return string 1. And that is going to be the entire program. Index, there we go. And as we can see, this will give us all of the different kind of cases, and it will show that every single one of the cases is indeed correct. So we just finished this with a while loop. Now, is a while loop the most efficient way to do this? Well, let's think about it. So this problem is all about incrementation. Essentially, we're just going from one index of the character to another index in the character, and it follows this pattern. Now, the for loop is essentially just going to be a specialized while loop. And the reason why the for loop is in fact better in this problem than a while loop is because the for loop is specialized in incrementation. Now, if we are to look at a for loop, so let's just delete all of this over here. So if we are to take a look at a for loop, we can see it is for I in range blah blah blah, right? So when we have for I in range blah blah blah, then we can see, well, when I is say whatever index we want it to be, it usually starts at 0. Then it will just take whatever letters over there, and it will do whatever we want over here. So I'll let you guys think about how exactly a for loop would work in here for now, and I'll give you guys about a minute to think about it. guys have been able to think about it. So, what we have over here is for I in range blah blah blah. So, what exactly is in this blah blah blah? Well, if we're going to go over to this website over here, and we can see that we have for I in range 0, 10, 3, right? So, what we can see over here is we have the lower end, which is the start, we have the higher end, which is the stop, and we have the final one, which is the increment or the step, right? So what we can do is we can either just copy or we can just write it over here, but essentially we have A, B, and C. So A will be 0 because we want to start at the index of 0. B will just be the length of string, right? Except it can't be length string, so it has to -1. And C will just be, instead of going with our regular 1 increment, we're going to go with our 2 increment. So that is going to be how our for loop is set up. Now, just as before, we're going to be wanting to return a string. So we are going to define an empty string again. So now that we have our empty string defined, we have our loop defined. All we need is we just need to find out the statement that goes inside of the for loop. So inside of the for loop, we can just do string1 is equal to string1 plus. Now, what do we want to add to it? Well, we just want to add string at index of I. So that is essentially going to be what we're going to return. Oh. Alright, so you guys can look at this for a little, and we are going to be moving on to our next problem momentarily. And after we kind of make sure that we understand this problem, this is very important as we move on to the sections, for loops and while loops are going to be very, I guess, prevalent, as loops are a very, very big part of programming. Okay, so now that you guys have had a good look at it, we're going to be going on to our next problem. So let's get that open. Okay, so this is going to be the review of the problem string times.
Okay, here we have problem 1 of warm-up to string times. I'll give you some time to read the instructions and then I'll explain it. Okay, here it says, given a string and a non-negative int n, return a larger string that is n copies of the original string. What this means is that you're given a string, which is basically a sequence of characters, and you are also given a non-negative integer called n. This problem wants you to return a string that is n copies of the original string. It gives you some examples here. So in the first example, the original string is hi, and it wants you to replicate hi 2 times. This results in hi, hi. So I think you get what you have to do. So in the beginning, we define a function called string times. There are 2 arguments, string, str, and n. So str is the original string and n is the integer.
Okay, so now let's open it up. We are going to be moving on to the second problem, which is front times. So Daniel will be going over this problem. Alrighty, so that kind of wraps up our course for right now. Here it is. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our class for today. So we went over warm-up 2. There are 6 more problems in this, I guess, problem set. So you guys can just go ahead and review over these 6 problems yourself. And once you go over these 6 problems, then you can get started on string 1, which is going to be over here. And string 1 is it's fairly easy, and we're going to be going over through these problems next class or the class after that. Thank you everyone for watching, and see you guys next week.